Hello, my name is Nick Deborah, and in this video, I wanted to talk about a technique that I've been using for a number of years called action dots to draw attention to metrics that require it on dashboards, and maybe contrast this technique with some more maybe traditional techniques like showing change versus previous period or using gauges or bullet graphs, for example. But I want to kind of start just by pointing out how kind of important it is that we actually have some kind of action indicators on our dashboards. Most dashboards that I come across kind of in the wild actually look like this, really no action indicators at all. And so this makes what I call the deadly assumption, which is the assumption that our users have enough background knowledge about all of these numbers, about all these metrics to actually figure out for themselves what requires action, what is doing well or poorly. Is that a safe assumption? Virtually never, right? And so for that reason, in fact, a dashboard like this, I think, is almost certainly going to die, right? To most users, most of the numbers are kind of meaningless, right? They don't know if they're good or bad. They need some help, essentially. And so, like I said, most dashboards that I encounter in the wild are like this, but there are maybe 10 or 20% that have some kind of action indicators on them. And you've probably seen most, if not all of these before, but I'm just going to quickly run through them just in case you're not familiar. Probably the most common one is showing change versus previous period versus the previous day or the previous month or the same month last year, same idea. Probably the second most common method is showing deviation from target, right? We set a target value for each metric and show the percentage difference between the target and the current value. Versus trailing average may be a little bit less common, but where we calculate, in this case, the trailing average of each metric for the last 30 days and show perhaps that the current value is 0.5% above or 2% below. There's also what I call single threshold, where we set a threshold, in this case, say, a 70% test score and flag anything that is on the wrong side of that threshold. Good, satisfactory, poor ranges. Probably don't have to explain these. You've seen these before. Gauges, also often called speedometers, and bullet graphs, maybe a bit of a less common technique, but a lot of people will recognize this chart type. Like I said, don't want to spend too much time on these. If you have questions about any of these, or you're perhaps not sure how to read them, you can just go to this page on my website, practicalreporting.com/action-indicators. Just type it into your browser and you'll get detailed explanatory videos about all of them. And unfortunately, though, dashboards that use these methods often die, at least in my experience. And so why exactly does this happen? There are a variety of problems that I've given kind of silly names to here that explain why these techniques, in fact, don't work very well. But before going through each one of these in turn, I just want to kind of explain action dots a little bit so I can kind of contrast them with these more conventional methods. And so a dashboard that uses action dots might look something like this. Even without any explanation, you can probably guess how to read this, right? We have some dark red dots, these probably big problems, medium problems, small problems, and that's exactly what these mean. And in fact, oh, look at this, we have some metrics that are actually doing a little bit better than expected, and maybe some that are doing a lot better than expected. And that is a correct reading of this dashboard. Obvious question, right? How did the dashboard kind of know where to put these sort of light, medium, dark red, green dots? Well, for each metric, in this case, calls answered per hour, we need 4 thresholds. And these thresholds have specific names and definitions. The first one is called crisis. And so this is the point where, if it ever got this bad, we'd pretty much drop everything and only work on this until it got better. And then there is what I call actionably bad. And so this is the point where we're not just unhappy, but we're so unhappy we're going to do something about it. We're going to cancel the project. We're going to launch an investigation. We're going to take some kind of action. And then there's actionably good, which is kind of the mirror image of that, right? It's the point where we're not just happy if it gets to this point. We're so happy, again, we're going to do something, right? We're going to promote somebody. We're going to put more funding into the project, whatever. And then there's best case. And so this is the point where, realistically, how good do we think this metric could ever get, right? It'll probably never get there, but if it ever did, we'd want it to be very noticeable on the dashboard, i.e. perhaps a very dark green color. And so these 4 thresholds are basically what kind of drive those dot colors. And of course, anything that is in between actionably bad and actionably good doesn't get a dot because by definition, it requires no action because that's what those terms actually mean. And in fact, most metrics actually fall in this range most of the time because, that's kind of reality, right? Most metrics actually don't require action most of the time. And that's why on a dashboard like this, in fact, most metrics actually aren't flagged, right? Because again, most metrics don't require attention most of the time. So how exactly does action dots solve these problems that I see with conventional methods? Well, let's look first at what I call Christmas tree syndrome. And so to understand what this problem is, let's look at a dashboard that is using one of the conventional methods that I mentioned, change in this case versus previous day. Great. All right. So what requires attention here? Well, apparently everything all the time, right? Because unless the current value is identical to the previous value, it's going to get flagged. And so we're basically flagging everything all the time, which is kind of the same as flagging nothing. So I have a very technical term for this. As I mentioned, I call this Christmas tree syndrome because our dashboard is lit up red and green, except in this case, it's Christmas 365 days a year because the dashboard always looks like this. And in fact, this problem pretty much applies to all the other methods too, right? Like a deviation from target. Well, again, unless the current value is identical to the target, we're going to flag it, which means we're flagging everything all the time. And same thing for deviation from trailing average. Yep. Or a good, satisfactory, poor. Well, our metrics always fall into one of those ranges, so we're flagging them all the time. Gauges, yeah, probably even worse. Whereas with action dots, this is really actually kind of the only method that I'm aware of that doesn't suffer from this Christmas tree syndrome. So we can actually get rid of the Christmas tree. And really, if a dashboard does suffer from Christmas tree syndrome, it will probably die, right? And so with action dots, we don't have to worry about that. Traditional methods can also make small problems look big or vice versa. And so to maybe see this in action, let's look at using deviation from target, right? Another very common method. Well, this doesn't look good. Units produced 13.5% below target. But just for fun, let's look at the last 14 days. Okay, so that 13.5%, that's this, right? Is this a disaster? Is this a crisis? No, this is just kind of a volatile metric, right? It bounces around a lot. It's 13% below target today. It'll be, 15% above target the next day and 20% below the one after that. And none of that really requires attention, right? So what looked like a big problem actually really wasn't a problem. Or how about another metric on our dashboard, website uptime? Doesn't look like much, right? Less than 1% off target. But just for fun, let's look at the last 14 days. Wow, okay, so that 0.9% below target, that's this. And so in this case, this is actually kind of a big deal because, for website uptime here, normally we're at like 100% or 99.9. And so the current value of 99.1 is actually very unusual. And when you think about it, if we're like an e-commerce company or something, what this means is that one out of every 100-page request to our website is failing. And so this could actually be a disaster. And yet it looked like nothing, right? It looked like a small problem on our dashboard. Whereas with action dots, of course, each metric gets its own set of thresholds, right? And so for units produced here, if it bounces around between 60 and 70, it's never going to get flagged, essentially, which is kind of what we want. Whereas with something like website uptime, like we're looking at, well, if it's, it falls outside of this very kind of narrow range, if it starts to drop below 99.8%, well, then it starts to get flagged, right? And so we can actually see when things are actually a problem or not. And so we don't really have to worry about this either. With traditional methods, it's also often difficult or impossible to spot metrics in crisis, right? If I have a dashboard like this, for example, that's using single threshold, where we just flag anything that's below a certain threshold on our dashboard, it's like, well, okay, I see a lot of red dots, but are any of these actually crises, or are any of them just kind of just poor enough to be flagged? I don't really know, right? Whereas with action dots, well, crises look different than metrics which are just enough to be kind of acted on, right? And so, I can see the difference between something that's just bad enough to require action, or worse, or a crisis, right? It actually looks different on the dashboard. And by the way, things that are doing extraordinarily well also look different on the dashboard, which traditional methods don't really flag. And so again, don't really have to worry about this with action dots. Another problem with conventional methods is that they can look really visually busy. And you really notice this with things like gauges. It's like, woof, they're just going to tune right out when they see something like this. Or bullet graphs as well. They tend to be very kind of busy looking. Whereas even though we're showing a lot of information on a dashboard like this, the fact that we're not flagging everything actually makes it much more kind of visually digestible. It doesn't look so overwhelming, even though this dashboard is actually showing more information than the last two that we were looking at. And so we don't really have to worry about this either. There's also kind of a strange problem with conventional methods where metrics that I call lower is better metrics, they don't work very well. And so this would be the case with a metric like defect rate, for example, where we actually want a lower number, right? We don't want a high defect rate, we want a low defect rate. But with a traditional kind of gauge design, doesn't really make sense, because if the needle goes to the right, well, it's going to go into the green zone, which doesn't really make sense, right? And so, one thing we could do is to perhaps flip it. Right? So now instead of going 0% to 10%, we're going 10% to 0%, and the colors are flipped. And so now at least if the defect rate goes down, it goes into the green zone, which is kind of what we want. But then we have a display where if the needle goes to the right, it's actually decreasing, which is really not what people I think would be expecting. So that would be kind of odd. Another thing we could do is perhaps just flip the colors, right? And so now if defect rate goes up, it actually goes into the red, which makes sense. But now, of course, this gauge is different than other gauges on the dashboard. It operates differently. And so whenever I see a gauge like this, I have to kind of mentally change gears. And so it can be kind of cognitively cumbersome. With action dots, we can handle lower is better metrics, but we need to make a change to the way the thresholds are set. And essentially we need to flip them, right? And so now for something like defect rate, where we want higher numbers to get flagged red, well, that's going to happen in a case like this, right? If we go up, it turns red. If they go down, it turns green, right? So low defect rate is flagged as good, and a high defect rate is flagged as bad. The important thing to note, though, is that for our users, they don't have to be aware of this at all, right? They don't care, right? They just look for red and green dots, and they don't have to worry about whether metrics are, lower is better numbers or higher is better numbers, right? So we just don't have to worry about that. And conventional methods are also kind of clunky with what I call Goldilocks metrics. And so this would be a metric like perhaps headcount deviation from plan. And so for this metric, we basically want this number to be as close to 0 as possible, or 0%, because we don't want to hire too many people, and we also don't want to hire too few people. But if we use the kind of traditional design of a bullet graph, which is what we're looking at in this particular case, it doesn't really make any sense, right? Because the traditional design has kind of a poor, satisfactory, and good zone. But in this case, if we hire too many people, it's going to go into the good zone, but that's actually bad. And so really, we need to kind of change it, right? And to say, okay, this part here needs to be kind of poor. And so now we have kind of a different design of bullet graph, right? It's poor, satisfactory, poor, not poor, satisfactory, good. And so if we're looking at a lot of bullet graphs, once again, some of them are going to be different. They're going to operate differently. And so I have to kind of change gears again, which is going to kind of slow things down. With action dots, again, I do need to make a small change. If I have a Goldilocks metric, I need to take my actionably good and switch it to an actionably bad, and my best case, and switch it to a crisis. So now I have 2 actionably bads and 2 crises. And of course, then I need to change the colors as well. And so now if a metric is too low, it's going to get flagged. It's going to turn red. And if it's too high, it's also going to turn red, which is what we want for a metric like this. And so once again, from the user's perspective, they don't have to worry about this at all, right? They just look for light red, dark red dots, and they don't have to worry about whether it's a Goldilocks metric or higher is better or higher is worse kind of number. It's all the same. So we don't have to worry about this either. Now, of course, not all of these methods, if I line them up like this, suffer from all of these problems. However, most of them suffer from most of these problems. But the thing is, any one of these can easily kill a dashboard, right? And so the fact that action dots don't suffer from any of these problems really dramatically increases the chances that your dashboard will not die, that people will still be using it 3 or 6 or 12 months down the line, right? When I show this technique to people, sometimes they have some objections. Like, for example, they might say action dots don't show as much detail as other methods, like bullet graphs, for example, where I can actually see what the thresholds actually are. But there's also kind of, in a way, kind of less information here, because for working capital, for example, I don't really know if it's like actually sort of doing just a little bit poorly or whether it's in crisis, right? If the crisis point is here, well, right now it's in crisis. But if the crisis point is here, then it's not in crisis. And here, I can't really tell the difference between, something that's just a little bit poor and a crisis. Whereas with action dots, I can actually see that. So I would actually argue that they communicate perhaps even more information. And then, you might even add tooltips, for example, for action dots, and then people can get very, very detailed information. But it's just there kind of on demand, essentially. It's not always there on the dashboard, like you have with gauges or bullet graphs, for example. Another common objection is that users can't distinguish between subtly different shades of red or green, but that's actually okay. With action dots, you only need 3 or 4 shades of red, 3 or 4 shades of green, and that's going to be sufficient. Sometimes people will also, say, well, action dots aren't colorblind safe, and that is true because people with the most common forms of color blindness can't tell the difference between red and green. However, you can simply substitute a colorblind safe color palette. It's going to work just fine. And there are, in fact, a slew of other advantages of action dots relative to specific methods as well, but don't really have time to get into that in this video. If you're interested, though, in learning more about action dots and many other techniques for making sure that your dashboards are still alive 3 or 6 or 12 months down the line, I will be teaching my Practical Dashboards course along with my Practical Charts course in January 2026, in case you happen to be watching before then. And then the Practical Dashboards course a week later. And if you happen to be watching this before December 1st, you can get a major discount on that workshop. Information about this workshop can be found at my website, practicalreporting.com. Thanks very much for watching.